Hey everyone, let's wrap up November. November was, I don't know, weird, strange. I once again only uploaded one video where I talked about a life update, how things are going, things that are going through my mind. And I thank you very much for all the feedback I got, for your comments and everything we shared. Thank you very much for that. I also uploaded a letter to the month. Thank you very much for still watching these. And that brings me to the books, because I uploaded a single review for Making Money. I've continued finally my reread of the Discworld novels. This is the 36th in the Discworld series and the second in the Moist Van Lipwijk series. Now, I don't recommend you start with this, but Going Postal, the first in the Moist Van Lipwijk series, is a very good starter book if you are interested in the Discworld, but you're not that big of a fantasy reader and you don't want to read all those books and you're scared off by that. The Moist Van Lipwijk books are more modern. They are set in Ankh-Morpork and they're all about the industrialization of the world and the city in particular, how things change and how the character of Moist Van Lipwijk is pushed into this by the patrician into moving the city forward. Now, Making Money is all about Moist being in the situation that he has to deal with the bank being in a bankrupt situation. There's a lot of fun going on. I really enjoyed how this book looks at the character of Moist Van Lipwijk, at the city, at the patrician, at his minglings and dealings in the background and his plans. I also enjoyed the talks about money and economy and the ideas around money and gold and what it is, what we cling to and everything. We get a lot of fun characters, we get a lot of fun adventures, and I highly recommend it. The rest of my reading in the months was a little bit all over the place, so we'll just go down the order I wrote them down. I listened to Dopamine mostly because I came across it in some kind of video that I saw, and it reminded me that it was on my wish list and that I wanted to read it, and I wanted to find out this idea of balance between pleasure and pain and energy. I talked a little bit about the book in the life update video, but mostly I think it's a very interesting book. It captures the idea of what dopamine is, what dopamine does in our body, and how we are struggling to find balance in our modern society and world. The author brings examples from her own lives, but also from her practice with clients that she had who had to deal and suffer with some serious addiction that really affected their lives. What I really liked as a reader, and also struggling with maybe reading a little bit too much this year as escapism and everything, was that she had her own example as falling down the rabbit hole of romance novels and the way she read them, how she dealt with that, and how she found or what she thought was problematic about that. Because she didn't say reading and reading a lot is problematic, but the way how she dealt and read those romance novels that she found in a way interestingly not so well. And I really enjoyed that. I found also that the book was very easily accessible. I listened to it on audiobook. I could just fly through it. I, of course, forgot a lot about the details because I listened to it very, very fast and didn't take any notes. Nevertheless, I think this book is really worth it. If you have been thinking about whether to read it or not, I would recommend just picking it up. I also listened to Frankenstein this month, which had been on my wish list, or TBR actually, for over a year. Last year I reread Chris Grimley's Frankenstein, and I thought, oh, it would be nice to listen to the story again. I've read Frankenstein before, and I've read Chris Grimley's Frankenstein, which is, I think, the version I'll enjoy the most when it comes to reading it. But then I saw on Audible that there is a version that was read by Jamie Bell, and I thought, why not give it a try, added it to my TBR and ignored it for a year. So now back to Frankenstein. It was nice to revisit the story, but it reminded me of why I struggled through the book for the first time I read it, and what I don't like about reading the book itself. The book has many letters and stories told and is very descriptive, and there are long parts that drag, and even on audio those dragged, and even knowing the story those dragged. And I think that's a big hurdle to get into the story and the topics and the themes of Frankenstein, that the writing itself doesn't really convince me as fly-through, captivating. It's more boring. And I must admit, I would not recommend listening to this version because it was not always easy to distinguish between the different characters. So the voices that Jamie Bell did for different characters were not so well done. And the audiobook itself was fine, but it added to the sameness and the dragginess of the text that it didn't really have that much life infused by different voices, if you know what I mean. But if you haven't ever read Frankenstein, I would recommend reading the text at least once, because it is worth it. Let's quickly talk about The River Judge, a very short story, which is sort of a prelude to The River Outlaws, I think is what the book is called, which I think is the first in the series, but there's no series yet. But it's a big fantasy book about, I don't know. But The River Judge was a short story about a young woman living in a small village with her parents. The parents own an inn, and there is a change in government, but the government feels very far away, and this little village really isn't that interested in paying taxes. I think it was taxes, that was the initial problem. Anyways, so there is a person who's supposed to deal with the villagers and things, but somehow the father turns up, killing that man and leaving him in the inn for the mother and the daughter to take care of. And that's mostly what happens in the story, how over years the father really mostly shows up to brag about how great he is, collect the money, and kill people and leave the dead bodies for the women to take care of. And it is interesting how that is portrayed, how that shapes the life of the woman, who we see it over multiple years, but also how it is perceived in the village, the actions the father does. And yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'm curious about The River Outlaws. The next book I picked up was more or less a disappointment. The Easy Life in Kamusari is a book about a high school kid finishing school in Japan, and his parents apparently are sick of him hanging around and doing nothing, so they sold him into forestry in Kamusari, which is apparently a forestry mountain village. So he goes there and he has to live with those people and learns minor skills, basic skills in forestry, and helps the villagers, or the company that he's been sold to sounds wrong, but it is an apprenticeship in sorts. He earns money, but he's away from everything for a year, and it's not the career that he would have chosen, but he just goes anyways. And it is written from his point of view, and he just someday starts off with, oh, I want to write down what happened here. And then he tells the story of the villagers, of his life there, of the forestry. And while it is not uninteresting, it's also not captivating. You don't really get too attached to the characters. You don't get attached to the narrator. The writing style sometimes doesn't feel the right age. At some points I kept thinking this is not a young boy who's writing that. In other situations, the actions show that he's young. So it's sort of a coming of age book. It's interesting for the part if you are interested in the forestry and how forests are maintained and the culture and beliefs around that. But if not, it's rather boring. Okay, 2 more things left, more or less. I picked up the Mistborn saga in November. So I listened to the first 3 books in the Wax and Wayne series, which is a follow-up to the Mistborn series. It's years later, but it still has the same magic system, but the world has moved on and is starting into an industrialization. The first book, The Alloy of Love, felt a lot like gunmen solving a train heist. So I didn't really see the connection to the Mistborn series other than the magic system and the world, but overall it felt like an adventure heist story, even though we were on the police side. We're not on the heist side, we're the police side. What is that story called? Anyways, it's what happened, they found out who did it, what happened, and then the next book happens with the same characters and moves on. In the third book, the bands of mourning, we get more connections to the Mistborn saga, to the Cosmere and all the things around. And I'm starting to think that the Cosmere that everyone is talking about when they talk about Brandon Sanderson and this huge universe that he created of interlocking different books and different series, that comes across in the Bands of Mourning more on its own for me. And I've also been reading short stories and novellas in the Arcanum Unbound. But since there are different stories for different spoilers in novels and series, I've been slow reading to that. But that is also a lot of background information, more on the world, the universe, and the things that connect everything. So I'm getting more and more into the world of Brandon Sanderson and the Cosmere, which, if you have been worried about reading a lot of Discworld novels and the size of the series, let me tell you, Brandon Sanderson trumps that anyhow. His books are endless, the series are long, and they seem to pop out faster than I can read and catch up. So let's see how that goes. But for the moment, I'm really enjoying the books, and I'm also really enjoying the writing style. The more I read Brandon Sanderson, the more I understand why he is so popular and what people like about his books. The magic is creative, the worlds are very creative, the characters feel real, they are really well portrayed, and his writing, it is good. You feel sometimes when you're reading that you can tell this is good writing. I cannot describe it otherwise because, of course, I forgot all the examples. And since I'm listening to the books now, I don't take notes. You know me, I don't annotate. But I've been actively thinking that he is really good at writing and portraying the situation, describing the situation, setting the scenery and giving the characters life. So I'm really enjoying the Cosmere right now. The last thing we need to talk about is Little Mushroom. Now, I have to say I didn't read the official English translation. I somehow ended up reading a fan translation or a translation when it was published as novel series, as a lot of Dunmai books are that are novel serializations that become published then for the rest of us who don't read those books, those online web novels. I might try that next year, but I digress. So I was looking for something that is very, very light on the romance, but I didn't really want romantasy. I wanted some form of fantasy or something that has a gripping story, but also interesting characters that have a romance, but I don't want it any spice and I don't want it to be any drama or anything. So I came across this and it was perfect. Little Mushroom is set in a world which is an apocalyptic world. The geomagnetic pole somehow stopped working and the world found itself in a very dire situation. The situation was solved by creating artificial poles. So there were 4 different cities or bases where humans still lived and survived. But by the time we get to the book, it's only 2 that are very much populated. And we find ourselves in one of them for most of the story. But that's later. The story begins with a little mushroom in the abyss where a lot of monsters live because mutations and monsters are very much the norm in this world right now. And our little mushroom is also some form of mutation, and he comes across this human that got attacked by another monster and he wants to help him, so he saves him and they got to talking, and then the mushroom takes on the personality and form of the human. So basically he consumes his genes and then he can transform himself into a human pretending to be him, because years before, or some time before, I don't think it was years, anyways, sometime before, the mushroom had his spore stolen or taken away by some humans that came to the abyss, and he wants to get it back. So he travels to the city, and on the way to the city, that's me going mostly blind into the story, knowing I'm reading something where there is a romance. So of course you look for the love interest, and every person we meet on the way to the city, I'm like, oh, who's this? Give me more. And you feel they're not really that much introduced, and once you get curious, they all die. It happens so much in this book that people die, not in a violent way all the time, but there is a huge death toll due to the violent world with all the mutations and the life that they are living. And I really enjoyed that part of the story. For me, not usually enjoying violence in books that much, but the way the world was portrayed and set up, I really enjoyed that. Also, once we reach the city and we definitely meet our love interest and how they meet and what's going on there, the whole thing is really well done and interesting. It constantly kept me on the edge of my seat because the world kept changing so much, and the mushroom and the love interest, they had to adapt. And it takes a long time until they get together. They meet and more like it's an enemy to lovers, but it's a strange enemy to lovers because we have the little mushroom who is trying and pretending to be a human and trying to fit in. And then we have the judge, who is the love interest, who is basically a loner and hated by everyone because he looks at people and decides if they are infected and need to be killed or not. So his job is basically killing people who were infected by part of the everything that's not humans. So basically, our little mushroom should be killed because he's not human, but it is so fascinating. I got so dragged into this. I highly enjoyed it. I highly recommend it if you are interested in any of these things. And the battery died. But we're finished anyways. I had a good November, reading and otherwise, sort of. I don't even know what I classify as good anymore. I have good days, I have bad days. It's passing by. I enjoyed what I read. I really enjoyed discovering Little Mushroom, and I really want to dive into more web novels, maybe reading them as they're coming out and not just when they are published. But there's such a big backlog of these kinds of novels that with everything, I need more time to read and to focus. But I still haven't won the lottery. Anyways, let me know in comments. How was your reading in November? Did you get to your backlog? Did you pick up new books that you were anticipating? Or did you fall into a rabbit hole of something completely new like I did? Well, it's not completely new for me, but you know what I mean. Thank you all for watching, and let's talk in comments.